By the summer of 1913, the limestone facade of Buckingham Palace facing the Mall in Westminster had been scraped clean and refaced in pale Portland stone, Sir Aston Webb's new east front catching the diluted London sun. High above the forecourt, a shallow balcony projects from the center room, its stone balustrade barely wider than a corridor step, framed by Corinthian columns and the royal coat of arms. It was added at the insistence of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in the 1840s, when Edward Blore's East Wing enclosed the old open courtyard and introduced this small ledge as a new architectural device, a stage built into the palace itself. From here, sovereigns would step out into the open air, turning private rooms into a public theater. The balcony promised visibility, adoration, continuity. It also removed the possibility of retreat. In photographs, the stone still looks permanent. The faces upon it do not. The ledge above the Mall began not as destiny, but as compromise. In the first decades of the 19th century, when John Nash received his royal commission from George IV to transform the old Buckingham House into a palace worthy of empire, the structure still faced inward. The king wanted grandeur on the scale of Carlton House, his former residence, and Nash obliged with sweeping state rooms arranged around a central courtyard that opened to the gardens in the west and maintained a modest, almost domestic front to the east. The architectural language spoke of privacy, of a court that looked upon itself rather than the city beyond its gates. Nash's vision, begun in earnest in 1826, embraced neoclassical proportion and French elegance. He raised colonnades and sculpted a marble arch as the ceremonial entrance, intending the palace to announce monarchy through refined taste rather than overbearing scale. Yet the king's ambitions soon outpaced both budget and lifetime. When George IV died in 1830, the palace remained incomplete, its interiors unfinished, its courtyard still raw with builders' scaffolding. His successor, William IV, showed little interest in the project and briefly considered converting the unfinished structure into barracks or a national gallery. It was only with the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 that Buckingham Palace acquired a committed royal occupant, and, with her, the pressures that would transform its architecture. Victoria moved into the palace within weeks of her coronation, despite Nash's incomplete work and the persistent smell of fresh plaster. The building, she noted in her journal, felt grand yet oddly contained, its rooms facing a courtyard that trapped noise and limited light. Edward Blore, who succeeded Nash after his dismissal over cost overruns, completed the state apartments and added an attic story to increase accommodation. But the fundamental problem remained. The palace was designed for ceremony within, not visibility without. Its eastern facade, the side facing what would become the Mall, presented only a series of windows and a modest entrance beneath the marble arch. There was no architectural acknowledgement of the growing crowds that gathered at the gates during moments of national significance. By the mid-1840s, Victoria's household had expanded. She and Prince Albert had 4 children by 1844, with more expected, and the palace's private apartments were proving insufficient. Albert, meticulous in his approach to royal logistics and deeply interested in architecture, proposed a practical solution: close the courtyard entirely by building a 4th wing along the eastern face, gaining additional rooms for the growing family, and creating a new, unified facade toward the public approach. Blore drew up plans for the East Wing in 1846, and construction began the following year under the supervision of builder Thomas Cubitt, whose firm had already transformed much of Belgravia and Pimlico with stuccoed elegance. The extension would add nurseries, guest rooms, and, crucially, a central suite of formal reception spaces that would mediate between the private life of the palace and the public world beyond its walls. It was during these design discussions that the balcony entered the architectural language of the monarchy. Victoria and Albert requested a projecting ledge at the center of the new facade, accessible from what would become the center room, a space intended for the family to gather before and after state occasions. The balcony would serve a dual function: a place to acknowledge crowds during celebrations and a threshold that allowed the sovereign to be seen without descending into the street. It was an architectural device borrowed from continental palaces and Italian villas, where external galleries and loggias mediated between interior authority and exterior acclaim. Here, in London, it would be compressed into a narrow stone rail barely 3 meters deep, framed by pilasters and crowned with the royal arms rendered in carved relief. The East Wing rose between 1847 and 1850, its bathstone facade adopting Bloor's restrained neoclassical style. The balcony, though structurally modest, became the visual focus of the composition, a horizontal ledge that interrupted the rhythm of windows and marked the ceremonial axis of the palace. From the street, it appeared almost delicate, a slight projection against the mass of the building. From within, it was a threshold of exposure, a door that opened not onto a terrace or garden, but onto the gaze of thousands. The architectural historian Nicolaus Pevsner would later describe Bloor's East Wing as decent but dull, lacking Nash's flair for sculptural drama. Yet its very restraint gave the balcony its power. Unadorned by excessive ornament, the stone balustrade and the shallow projection read as functional, a ledge for standing, not a stage for performance. This architectural understatement would prove central to the balcony's eventual cultural role. It did not demand attention through grandeur. It framed those who stood upon it, allowing the human figures to become the focus while the architecture receded into a neutral backdrop. By the time the East Wing was completed, Victoria had borne 7 children, and the palace had become not only a seat of government but a domestic symbol, a place where monarchy performed both statecraft and family life. The balcony, though not yet iconic, was ready. It awaited only a moment that would teach the nation to look upward toward that narrow strip of stone and find in it a recurring image of continuity. Records from the royal collection note that the balcony was structurally completed by late 1850, its Portland stone balusters shaped in a rhythm of classical order, its floor laid in weatherproof slabs that would bear the weight of multiple generations. The glass doors behind it, opening from the center room, were fitted with locks and heavy drapery, maintaining the palace's interior privacy until the moment of deliberate revelation. What began as an architectural convenience, a way to solve the problem of crowd acknowledgement without abandoning palatial distance, would soon become a stage upon which national emotions would be projected, rehearsed, and eventually scrutinized. The balcony's first significant appearance in the public imagination came not with fanfare, but with pragmatic ceremony. On the 1st of May, 1851, the Great Exhibition opened in Hyde Park, housed within Joseph Paxton's vast Crystal Palace, a cathedral of glass and iron that announced Britain's industrial supremacy to the world. Prince Albert had championed the project for years, seeing in it an opportunity to position the monarchy as patron of progress rather than relic of feudal tradition. The exhibition would draw 6 million visitors over 5 months, a spectacle of global trade and technological optimism set against the uncertain politics of post-revolutionary Europe. London swelled with crowds, the parks filled with pavilions, the streets thronged with visitors from the provinces and the continent, and Buckingham Palace, situated at the ceremonial heart of the capital, became a focal point for national pride. On the opening day, Victoria and Albert processed from the palace to Hyde Park in an open carriage, cheered along Constitution Hill and Rotten Row. When they returned in late afternoon, crowds had gathered along the Mall and pressed against the palace railings, calling for the Queen to appear. It was a moment of collective euphoria, industrial achievement mingling with imperial confidence, and the palace, with its newly completed East Wing, offered an architectural solution to the demand for visibility. Victoria stepped onto the balcony for the first time that evening. Contemporary accounts in The Times and the Illustrated London News described the scene with restrained enthusiasm. The Queen appearing at the center of the facade, Prince Albert beside her, their children glimpsed through the doors behind. The crowd cheered, hats were raised, and then, within minutes, the royal party withdrew. The appearance lasted no more than 5 minutes, a brief acknowledgement rather than an extended performance. Yet the image lingered. The pale stone of the new facade catching the evening light, the figures framed against the palace's dark interior, the balcony functioning as a proscenium that turned private presence into public theater. The architectural historian Sir John Summerson later noted that this moment marked a shift in the monarchy's relationship with urban space. Prior to the East Wing's completion, royal appearances had been processional, carriages moving through streets, ceremonies conducted in churches or parliament. The balcony introduced a static, frontal mode of visibility. The monarch did not need to enter the crowd. The architecture allowed the crowd to approach the monarch while maintaining a physical and symbolic distance. The stone balustrade became a boundary that was simultaneously welcoming and insurmountable, an edge that invited the gaze while forbidding the touch. In the weeks following the Great Exhibition's opening, the balcony began to establish a rhythm of use. State visits occasioned further appearances, as did military reviews and the occasional patriotic celebration. Each time, the pattern repeated. Doors opened, figures emerged, a brief pause for acknowledgement, then retreat. The architectural threshold mediated between interior authority and exterior acclaim, and the nation began to learn the visual grammar of this new ceremonial device. Newspapers illustrated the palace with the balcony as its central feature. Artists sketched the scene, and soon the image became familiar, an expected element of national ritual. Yet the balcony's early use also revealed its limitations. The narrow depth of the projection meant that only a small number of people could comfortably occupy the space. During large family appearances, figures crowded against the balustrade, their spatial discomfort visible in photographs where bodies pressed together in an effort to remain within the frame of public visibility. The stone ledge, designed for occasional use by one or two individuals, was being asked to contain dynastic narratives that required larger casts. The architecture, in its modest scale, imposed constraints even as it offered exposure. Prince Albert understood this tension. In letters preserved in the royal archives, he reflected on the balcony as a tool of modern monarchy, a way to maintain dignity while acknowledging the democratizing pressures of the age. "The people wish to see their sovereign," he wrote to a German correspondent in 1852, "and it is our duty to be seen, but always within the bounds that preserve the mystery necessary to majesty." The balcony, in this view, was a controlled aperture, allowing visibility without vulnerability, presence without intimacy. The Great Exhibition closed in October 1851, its success cementing both industrial confidence and the monarchy's association with progress. The Crystal Palace was dismantled and relocated to Sydenham, where it would stand until destroyed by fire in 1936. But the balcony at Buckingham Palace remained, its stone unchanged, its function now established. What had begun as an architectural afterthought, a projection added to solve a domestic space problem, had become a symbolic stage. In the years that followed, the balcony would host a widening array of occasions: royal birthdays, military victories, the opening and closing of Parliament. Each use reinforced the pattern, and each reinforcement made the balcony more essential to the choreography of monarchy. By the end of Victoria's reign, it would be inconceivable to imagine a moment of national significance without the corresponding image of figures on that ledge, framed by stone and columns, waving to crowds below. The limestone of the balustrade, quarried from Portland and shaped by stonemasons trained in classical proportion, bore the marks of its first decade of use: slight weathering at the corners, faint discoloration where hands gripped the rail. The glass doors behind, their frames painted in royal cream, were cleaned weekly by palace staff, their hinges oiled to ensure smooth operation during ceremonial moments. Inside the center room, red carpets muffled footsteps and chandeliers cast soft light across walls hung with Chinese silk. The interior remained private, invisible to the crowds below, but the balcony rendered that privacy conditional. It was a door that could be opened, a threshold that could be crossed, an architecture that promised the monarchy would always be available for public consumption, on its own carefully controlled terms. A writer in the Illustrated London News, reflecting on the Queen's balcony appearances during the 1850s, observed, "The palace has given us a window into majesty, though the view is brief and the glass, one suspects, carefully polished." It was an apt metaphor. The balcony offered visibility, but it was a visibility curated by architecture, limited by stone, and always subject to the decision of those within. The crowd could look, but it could not enter. The sovereign could appear, but could also vanish. The stone ledge held both promises and refusals in its elegant neoclassical balance. By the 1860s, the balcony had become routine, a predictable element in the ceremonial vocabulary of the British state. Victoria used it sparingly after Albert's death in 1861, retreating into prolonged mourning that saw the palace shuttered and the balcony empty for months at a time. When she did appear, often pressed by ministers concerned about Republican sentiment, the contrast between her black mourning dress and the pale Portland stone created a visual grammar of loss that photographers captured and newspapers reproduced. The balcony, designed to project strength and continuity, instead framed absence and withdrawal. Yet, even in disuse, the architectural device retained its symbolic weight. Political cartoonists of the 1860s and 1870s drew the empty balcony as a critique of Victoria's seclusion, the vacant stone rail suggesting a monarchy that had abandoned its public obligations. The image worked because the balcony had already established itself as the expected site of royal visibility. Its emptiness registered as refusal, its silence as commentary. The architecture, intended to facilitate appearance, could also dramatize disappearance. Victoria's prolonged mourning tested the balcony's symbolic function, but it also revealed the depth to which the device had embedded itself in national consciousness. When she finally returned to more regular public engagement in the late 1870s, prompted by Benjamin Disraeli's political maneuvering and the theater of the 1877 Imperial Durbar that proclaimed her Empress of India, the balcony resumed its role. Golden Jubilee celebrations in 1887 and Diamond Jubilee festivities in 1897 brought crowds back to the Mall, and the Queen, now elderly and frail, appeared on the balcony in both instances, her figure small against the stone, her presence sufficient to generate headlines and commemorative illustrations across the empire. The 1887 Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years since Victoria's accession, saw the balcony used strategically to frame dynastic continuity. The Queen appeared not alone but surrounded by children, grandchildren, and the extended royal family, a visual assertion that the monarchy would persist beyond her reign. Photographs from that day show the balcony crowded with figures in formal dress, the stone balustrade nearly obscured by the press of bodies. The architectural space, designed for restraint, was being asked to contain abundance, and the resulting images conveyed both the dynasty's scale and the balcony's spatial limitations. Newspapers noted the challenge. The Morning Post observed in its coverage of the Jubilee that the balcony, though adequate for ceremonial acknowledgement, proved barely sufficient to contain the royal party, several members of which were obliged to remain inside the center room, visible through the open doors, but unable to step fully into public view. This spatial constraint would become a recurring theme, an architectural fact that carried political meaning. Who stood on the balcony and who remained inside was not only a question of space, but of hierarchy, favor, and the careful staging of dynastic succession. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897, coming a decade later, presented a different visual narrative. Victoria, now 78 and increasingly immobile, made only a brief balcony appearance, her figure supported by attendants and her face, in photographs, registering the exhaustion of age. The celebration was vast, a procession through London that took hours, a service at St. Paul's Cathedral conducted outside so the Queen would not have to climb steps, and a return to Buckingham Palace where the balcony functioned as the final stage in a day-long performance of imperial power. Yet, the image that endured was of fragility. An elderly woman on a narrow ledge of stone, waving to a crowd that stretched down the Mall toward Admiralty Arch, her presence both commanding and precarious. In architectural terms, the balcony by the 1890s had settled into its mature form. The stone balustrade showed wear, edges softened by decades of hands gripping the rail, balusters faintly streaked by London's soot-laden rain. The palace administration had begun regular cleaning and maintenance, recognizing that the balcony's visibility made its condition a matter of public scrutiny. Masons were employed to repair weathering, painters to refresh the window frames, and glaziers to replace any cracked panes in the center room doors. The architecture, though still relatively young, was being preserved as if it were ancient, a recognition that the balcony had become more than functional space. It was now heritage, an image inseparable from the monarchy itself. Victoria's death in January 1901 brought the reign to a close, but the balcony outlasted her. Edward VII, ascending to the throne at 59, used the balcony with greater ease and frequency than his mother had in her later years. His reign, though brief, saw the balcony employed for military reviews, state visits, and the occasional royal birthday. The Edwardian years brought a lightness to the palace's public image, less imperial solemnity, more cosmopolitan charm, and the balcony reflected this shift. Photographs from the period show Edward in naval uniform, Queen Alexandra beside him in elaborate hats and lace, the couple projecting confidence rather than the mournful weight that had characterized Victoria's later appearances. Yet beneath the Edwardian polish, the empire was fracturing. The Boer War had exposed military vulnerabilities, industrial unrest challenged domestic stability, and across Europe, monarchies faced pressures that would soon erupt into catastrophic war. The balcony, still functioning as a stage for continuity and celebration, would soon be asked to carry darker meanings, to frame not only triumph but anxiety, not only presence, but the desperate performance of resilience in the face of collapse. By 1910, when Edward VII died and George V succeeded him, the balcony had been in use for nearly 60 years. It had witnessed jubilees and funerals, celebrations and withdrawals. Its stone had borne the weight of Victoria's mourning and Edward's confidence. It had framed images that circulated globally, reproduced in newspapers, postcards, and souvenir prints. The architecture, in its modest proportions and restrained classicism, had become one of the most recognizable thresholds in the world, a ledge where private life met public expectation, where the monarchy stepped out of its palace and into history. The balustrade, cleaned in 1911 as part of preparations for George V's coronation, gleamed white in photographs from that year. The center room behind, redecorated with Chinese lacquer panels and gilt furnishings, remained invisible to the crowds, but described in court circulars and society columns. The doors, freshly painted, opened smoothly. The stone, solid beneath royal feet, seemed permanent. In 3 years, the world it had framed would begin to collapse, and the balcony would be asked to hold a nation together, even as empires fell and dynasties vanished across the continent. The ledge above the mall would become not only a stage, but a test of architecture, of monarchy, and of the fragile compact between a family and the people who looked up at them, expecting something that stone alone could never provide. On the evening of August 4, 1914, Britain entered the First World War. By nightfall, crowds had gathered outside Buckingham Palace, drawn by rumor, anxiety, and the need for visible leadership in a moment of national crisis. King George V, who had succeeded his father 4 years earlier, stepped onto the balcony with Queen Mary shortly after the cabinet's decision was confirmed. They appeared not in ceremonial dress but in the somber attire of wartime duty, George in naval uniform, Mary in dark silk. The balcony, which for decades had framed celebrations and jubilees, now carried a different weight. The stone rail, unchanged, marked a threshold between the certainty of peace and the unknowable future of total war. The crowd below did not cheer in the way they had for Victoria's jubilees. Contemporary accounts in the Times and the Daily Mail describe instead a sustained, anxious applause, punctuated by shouts of "God save the King," that felt more like prayer than patriotism. The king raised his hand in acknowledgement, a gesture captured in photographs that show his face set in grim determination. The balcony appearance lasted only minutes, but its significance was understood immediately. This was not theater, it was testimony, a public confirmation that the monarchy stood with the nation in a conflict whose scale and duration no one yet comprehended. Over the next 4 years, the balcony would host repeated appearances tied to the rhythms of war. Recruitment drives, military victories, memorial services, and visits by Allied leaders all occasioned moments when George V and Queen Mary would step out onto the ledge to acknowledge crowds that grew larger and more desperate as casualty lists lengthened. The architectural space, designed for brief ceremonial acknowledgement, was being asked to contain the nation's grief, its hope, and its demand for reassurance. The stone balustrade, barely 3 meters deep, became a stage for emotions it was never built to hold. In 1917, midway through the war, George V made a decision that would bind the balcony even more tightly to the monarchy's identity. Responding to anti-German sentiment and the political dangers facing royal houses across Europe, the Tsar had just been overthrown in Russia, and German monarchies were under siege. He issued a proclamation on July 17th renaming the British royal house. The Germanic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, inherited through Prince Albert, was replaced with Windsor, a name drawn from the medieval castle west of London and free of continental association. The change was pragmatic, even cynical, a branding exercise designed to distance the monarchy from its German relatives and align it more firmly with English tradition. Yet the renaming worked because it attached itself to existing architecture. Windsor Castle provided historical depth, but Buckingham Palace, and specifically its balcony, provided contemporary visibility. Newspapers reporting the name change illustrated their coverage with images of the palace facade, the balcony at its center. The House of Windsor was not only a genealogical designation, but an architectural one, and the balcony became the physical emblem of this rebranded dynasty. The stone ledge, built by Victoria and Albert decades earlier, was now retroactively claimed as the stage of Windsor continuity, as if the family had always stood there, as if the architecture itself guaranteed legitimacy. The war ended on November 11, 1918, and within hours, crowds surged toward Buckingham Palace. By mid-afternoon, the mall was impassable, packed with civilians and soldiers celebrating the armistice. George V and Queen Mary appeared on the balcony repeatedly throughout the day, each appearance greeted with renewed cheering, singing, and weeping. Newsreel footage from that day shows the balcony filled not only with the King and Queen, but with their children, the future Edward VIII and George VI among them, and various officials and military leaders. The stone rail, designed for a controlled ceremony, was now the center of a spontaneous outpouring of relief and exhaustion. The architectural historian David Cannadine, in his study of British ceremonialism, notes that the armistice balcony appearances marked a shift in the monarchy's symbolic function. The king was no longer simply a constitutional figurehead or imperial sovereign. He had become a focal point for collective emotion, a figure onto whom the nation projected its need for stability in the aftermath of catastrophe. The balcony enabled this projection. It provided the physical stage and the visual frame that made the emotional transaction possible. George V did not need to speak. His presence on the stone ledge, framed by the palace's columns in the royal coat of arms, was sufficient. In the years immediately following the war, the balcony settled into a new role. It was no longer merely ceremonial, but commemorative, a place where victory was remembered and loss acknowledged. Armistice Day balcony appearances became annual events, with George V standing in silence alongside veterans and officials during the 2-minute silence at 11 a.m. on November 11th each year. The stone balustrade, which had once framed celebration, now also held grief. Photographs from these commemorations show the king's face stern, his posture rigid, the architectural space functioning as a silent chapel as much as a public platform. Yet the balcony's association with wartime duty also created new expectations. The monarchy had used the ledge to demonstrate solidarity, and the public now expected that solidarity to be visible and recurring. The balcony became a barometer of royal engagement. Its use signaled presence, its emptiness suggested absence or indifference. This dynamic would shape the monarchy's relationship with architecture for the rest of the century. The stone rail was no longer merely a convenience, it was an obligation. The center room behind the balcony, redecorated in 1919 with new furnishings intended to mark the post-war era, remained private. but its existence as the threshold to public visibility gave it symbolic weight. Courtiers noted that the room became a space of preparation and anxiety, where royal figures gathered before stepping out into view. The glass doors, polished to transparency, marked the boundary between control and exposure. Inside, private conversations and last-minute adjustments to dress. Outside, the crowd's gaze and the camera's lenses. The balcony was the hinge between these worlds, and crossing it required a transformation from individual to symbol. By the early 1920s, the balcony had become so central to royal iconography that its image appeared on everything from postage stamps to souvenir china. The stone balustrade, its rhythm of balusters now reproduced in mass-manufactured illustrations, was more familiar to many Britons than their own doorsteps. This ubiquity brought a kind of architectural amnesia. Few remembered that the balcony had been built within living memory, that it was a Victorian addition rather than a medieval inheritance. It had become, in the public imagination, timeless, as if the House of Windsor had always stood there, as if the stone itself guaranteed continuity through the upheavals of modernity. The First World War had asked the balcony to do something unprecedented, to hold not only celebration but crisis, not only triumph but endurance. The stone had proven adequate to the task, but the cost was a permanent shift in what the monarchy owed the public. The ledge above the mall was no longer optional, it was required. And with that requirement came a new kind of trap, the obligation to perform stability even when stability was an illusion, to project continuity even as the world fractured. The balcony had survived the war. Whether the family it framed could survive the peace remained in 1920 an open question. The first peacetime wedding to employ the balcony as a ceremonial endpoint occurred on February 28, 1922, when Princess Mary, only daughter of George V and Queen Mary, married Viscount Lascelles at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony itself followed traditional lines, processions, anthems, the measured choreography of state religion. But the return to Buckingham Palace introduced a new ritual. After the carriage procession down the mall, the wedding party stepped onto the balcony for what court circulars described as a public acknowledgement of well-wishers. Photographers positioned in the mall captured the scene. Princess Mary in white satin and lace, Viscount Lascelles in military dress, flanked by bridesmaids and family, all framed by the now familiar stone balustrade. The image appeared in newspapers across Britain and the Empire the following day, and the balcony's association with royal weddings began to solidify. What had been an improvised moment during Victoria's reign, appearing after a ceremony to acknowledge crowds, was now codified as expected ritual. The balcony became the visual conclusion to the wedding narrative, the moment that transformed private vows into public spectacle. The stone ledge, in this context, functioned as a threshold of confirmation. The marriage was real because it had been displayed on the balcony, witnessed by the crowd, captured by cameras. A year later, on April 26, 1923, the pattern repeated with greater consequence. Prince Albert, Duke of York, and second son of George V, married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that drew even larger crowds than his sister's wedding. Lady Elizabeth, daughter of a Scottish earl, was not of royal blood, and her marriage to the Duke represented a subtle shift in royal matrimonial practice, a move toward British aristocracy rather than European royalty, a domestication of the dynasty in the aftermath of continental monarchical collapse. The wedding itself was modest by earlier royal standards, but the balcony appearance was not. Photographs from that day show the Duke and Duchess of York standing at the center of the balcony, he in RAF uniform, she in ivory chiffon and a veil of Flanders lace. Behind them, the glass doors of the center room frame additional family members, George V and Queen Mary, visible in the shadows of the interior. The composition is deliberate. The newlyweds occupy the most prominent position, while the older generation recedes. The balcony, narrow as it is, can stage hierarchy as well as celebration. Who stands at the rail and who remains just inside communicates dynastic order without a word spoken. The interwar years saw the balcony increasingly employed for weddings, each one reinforcing the association between the stone ledge and romantic narrative. Yet the architectural space imposed its own constraints on these narratives. The balcony could hold only a limited number of people, which meant that wedding parties had to be carefully curated. Bridesmaids, pages, extended family, all had to be arranged not for intimacy but for visibility, for the cameras positioned below and the crowds pressing against the palace railings. The result was a kind of choreographed awkwardness, visible in photographs where figures crowd together, their smiles fixed, their bodies angled toward the street in poses that feel simultaneously natural and staged. The cultural historian Dr. Ed Owens, in his study of 20th century royal pageantry, notes that the interwar balcony appearances marked a shift toward what he calls emotional monarchy, a model in which the royal family's private relationships were increasingly presented as public property. The wedding kiss, though not yet standard practice in the 1920s, was already being hinted at in press coverage. Newspapers described the Duke and Duchess of York as visibly affectionate during their balcony appearance, and cartoonists depicted the couple in romantic tableau. The balcony, intended as a site of dignified acknowledgement, was being subtly redefined as a stage for intimacy, or at least the performance of intimacy. This shift carried risks. By opening the balcony to romantic display, the monarchy made its personal relationships subject to public scrutiny. The stone rail no longer protected privacy. It framed vulnerability. When marriages succeeded, the balcony could be used to celebrate them. When they failed, as several royal marriages would in the decades to come, the balcony would become a site of uncomfortable theater, a place where fractured relationships had to be performed as intact for the sake of continuity. The balcony itself remained architecturally unchanged during this period, though the palace administration increased its maintenance in response to the growing importance of photography. The stone balustrade was cleaned annually, its balusters inspected for cracks or weathering. The center room behind was redecorated several times during the 1920s and 1930s, each iteration reflecting changing tastes in royal interiors, less Victorian clutter, more streamlined elegance. Yet the doors themselves and the threshold they marked stayed constant. The glass panes were replaced when necessary, the frames repainted in royal cream, the brass hinges polished to gleaming. Inside the center room, courtiers began to recognize the space as a kind of emotional airlock, a place where royal figures had to transform themselves before stepping into public view. Memoirs and diaries from palace staff described the rituals that occurred in that room, final adjustments to dress, whispered instructions from private secretaries, the nervous energy of figures about to cross the threshold into visibility. The room itself was comfortable. Thick carpets, upholstered chairs, ambient light from crystal chandeliers, but its proximity to the balcony gave it an edge of tension. It was the last private space before exposure, the final moment before performance. By the late 1920s, the balcony had become so embedded in royal ceremonial that its absence was notable. Smaller, private royal occasions, christenings, quiet family gatherings, were sometimes criticized in the press specifically because they did not include a balcony appearance. The expectation had been established. Significant royal events should be visible from the mall, framed by that particular stone ledge, acknowledged by that particular waving gesture. The architecture had created a demand that the family now struggled to satisfy without exhausting themselves or overexposing their private lives. The economic pressures of the interwar years also shaped the balcony's symbolic function. The general strike of 1926, the ongoing industrial decline, and the widening gap between royal wealth and working-class poverty made every display of monarchical splendor politically fraught. Wedding balcony appearances, with their focus on personal happiness and dynastic continuity, offered a kind of escapism, a narrative that distracted from economic anxiety. Yet, they also invited criticism. Photographs of royals in jewels and silk, standing on a palace balcony while millions struggled with unemployment, could be read as insensitivity, as easily as inspiration. George V, aware of these tensions, attempted to moderate the balcony's use, instructing that appearances should be brief and dignified rather than prolonged or theatrical. Yet the public appetite for royal visibility, especially in the increasingly visual culture of newsreels and illustrated magazines, made restraint difficult. The balcony had become a commodity as much as an architectural feature, a recurring image that sold newspapers, generated tourism, and reinforced Britain's sense of itself as a nation with traditions that endured despite economic and political upheaval. As the 1930s progressed and Europe moved toward another catastrophic conflict, the balcony's association with weddings would give way once more to its role in war. But the interwar years had established a pattern that would persist. The stone ledge above the mall was now the place where the monarchy performed happiness, where private relationships were converted into public reassurance. The architecture, in its narrow neoclassical restraint, had become a stage for emotions it was never designed to contain. Joy, certainly, but also the pressure to project joy regardless of the reality behind the doors. The Second World War arrived in September 1939, and with it, the balcony entered its most sustained period of symbolic use. Within days of Britain's declaration of war on Germany, crowds again gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and George V's son, now George VI, and having unexpectedly ascended the throne in 1936 after his brother Edward VIII's abdication, appeared on the balcony with Queen Elizabeth and their two daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. The family stood in daylight, dressed in somber tones, the king in naval uniform, and the image was broadcast by newsreel to cinemas across the nation. The balcony, framed by sandbags visible at ground level and anti-aircraft guns positioned in nearby parks, no longer projected invulnerability. It projected a determined presence. Over the next 6 years, the palace itself became a target. On September 13, 1940, during the height of the Blitz, German bombers struck Buckingham Palace directly. 5 high-explosive bombs fell on the complex, one destroying the royal chapel, another cratering the quadrangle, and a third damaging the north wing structure. The palace staff, including the king and queen who had refused evacuation to Windsor or Canada, sheltered in basement rooms as plaster dust-filled corridors and windows shattered across the facade. Remarkably, the east wing and its balcony suffered only minor damage. Cracked window panes in the center room, superficial scoring on the Portland stone from shrapnel, nothing that prevented its continued use. Queen Elizabeth's response to the bombing became famous. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she reportedly told a London politician. "Now I can look the East End in the face." The comment, whether precisely accurate or diplomatically reconstructed, captured the symbolic function of the palace and, by extension, the balcony, now served. The royal family's physical vulnerability, their refusal to leave London despite danger, and their continued appearances on the balcony during air raids created a narrative of shared suffering. The stone ledge, which had once framed imperial triumph, now framed endurance. Throughout the war, George VI and Queen Elizabeth made regular balcony appearances tied to military events and morale-building exercises. Photographs from these years show the king and queen in steel helmets, in uniform, or in the practical clothing of civil defense. The balcony itself was sometimes obscured by camouflage netting draped across parts of the facade, an attempt to reduce the palace's visibility to German bombers. Yet even partially hidden, the balcony retained its symbolic power. When it was revealed, netting drawn back for ceremonial appearance, the gesture itself communicated resilience. The monarchy was still here, the architecture intact enough to function, the nation surviving. Princess Elizabeth, who turned 18 in 1944, joined her parents on the balcony with increasing frequency as the war progressed. Photographs show her in the uniform of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, having insisted on active service despite her status as heir presumptive after her uncle's abdication. Her presence on the balcony during wartime introduced a generational dimension, the future of the monarchy visible beside its present, both framed by the same stone rail that had held Victoria a century earlier. The architecture, in its continuity, promised that monarchy would outlast war, that the ledge would still be there when peace returned. That peace came on May 8, 1945. VE Day brought the largest crowds Buckingham Palace had ever witnessed. By noon, the mall was impassable, packed with civilians, soldiers on leave, and families who had traveled from across the country to mark the end of the European conflict. George VI, Queen Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, and Princess Margaret appeared on the balcony 8 times that day, each appearance greeted with renewed cheering, singing of "God Save the King," and spontaneous outbursts of relief and joy. Newsreel footage from the day shows the balcony overflowing, not only the royal family, but Winston Churchill in his siren suit, joining one of the appearances, his presence adding political authority to dynastic continuity. The most famous image from VE Day, reproduced endlessly in subsequent decades, shows the royal family waving from the balcony as floodlights illuminate the facade and fireworks burst above the Victoria Memorial. The photograph captures not only celebration, but exhaustion. The king's face, even in grainy black and white, shows the strain of 6 years of war and the stammer that had plagued his public speaking throughout. Queen Elizabeth, beside him, appears both joyful and relieved. The princesses, young and smiling, represent the future, and behind them, visible through the center room's open doors, courtiers and officials crowd the interior, everyone trying to glimpse the crowd below or catch a moment on the balcony's narrow stage. Princess Elizabeth later recalled V-Day in interviews as one of the most memorable nights of my life. She and Princess Margaret, she revealed decades later, were allowed to leave the palace incognito and mingle with the crowds in the mall, experiencing the celebration from the street rather than the balcony. "We stood outside and shouted, 'We want the king,'" she remembered, and we were swept along by the tide of happiness. The anecdote is remarkable for what it reveals about the balcony's function. Even the future queen wanted to be on the other side of it, looking up rather than down, part of the crowd rather than the spectacle. The architectural threshold created a division that even royal privilege found constraining. The balcony's wartime left physical marks. The stone balustrade, inspected in 1946, showed pitting from shrapnel and weathering from 6 years of reduced maintenance. The center room behind had been stripped of valuable furnishings early in the war, its chandeliers taken down, its carpets rolled and stored. The glass doors, replaced multiple times after bomb damage, bore scratches and imperfections. Yet the structure remained sound. Masons brought in to assess the East Wing in 1946 reported that the balcony's foundational support, cantilevered iron beams embedded in the masonry, had held firm despite nearby explosions. The architecture, like the monarchy it served, had survived. Post-war restoration began in 1947, with craftsmen carefully cleaning the Portland stone and repairing damaged balusters. The work was documented in photographs now held by the Imperial War Museums, showing scaffolding around the balcony and workers in cloth caps running their hands over the stone, checking for cracks invisible to the eye. The restoration was not merely functional, but symbolic, an assertion that Britain, despite exhaustion and economic crisis, would rebuild its ceremonial architecture as it rebuilt its cities. By 1948, the balcony had been returned to its pre-war condition, at least superficially. Yet something had changed in how it was perceived. The war had transformed the balcony from a stage of triumph into a witness of survival. The stone rail had held the royal family during bombings, blackouts, and the long uncertainty of total war. It had framed not only military victory, but the daily grinding persistence required to reach that victory. The balcony was no longer merely decorative or ceremonial. It had become, in the public imagination, a symbol of continuity through catastrophe. When Princess Elizabeth married Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten on November 20, 1947, in the austere conditions of post-war Britain, the balcony appearance after the Westminster Abbey ceremony drew enormous crowds despite rationing, fuel shortages, and the coldest winter in decades. The image of the young couple on the balcony, she in a gown whose fabric had required special coupon allocation, he in naval uniform, offered a glimpse of normalcy returning, of rituals resuming, of the balcony once again framing happiness rather than endurance. Yet the war's shadow remained. In photographs from that wedding, the stone balustrade is visible, cleaned and repaired, but the city beyond, visible in aerial shots, still shows bomb sites, rubble, and the gaps where buildings once stood. The balcony had survived intact, but the London it overlooked had been shattered and was only beginning to rebuild. The architecture, in its continuity, stood in sharp contrast to the disruption all around it. And in that contrast lay both the balcony's power and its growing burden. It had to project stability even when stability was fragile, continuity even when the world had been broken. The stone could not admit doubt. The faces upon it could not show uncertainty. The balcony had become a stage where only one narrative was permitted, the narrative of permanence. And everyone who stood on it knew that permanence was always a performance, never a guarantee. The death of George VI in February 1952 brought his daughter to the throne as Elizabeth II, and with her a new relationship between the balcony and the media age. Her coronation, held on June 2, 1953, at Westminster Abbey, was the first to be televised in full, broadcast live to millions across Britain and the Commonwealth. Cameras positioned in the Abbey captured the ceremony, but the image that would be replayed most frequently in the following decades was filmed at Buckingham Palace, the newly crowned Queen, wearing the imperial state crown and coronation robes, stepping onto the balcony with the Duke of Edinburgh beside her. The balcony appearance after the coronation lasted over 20 minutes, significantly longer than any previous ceremonial use. Elizabeth II appeared multiple times throughout the day, first in full regalia, later in evening dress after changing inside the palace. Each appearance was timed to coincide with the RAF flypast, which roared over the mall in formations that included Spitfires, Lancasters, and the new jet-powered Canberras. The crowd below, estimated at over 1 million people stretching from the palace gates down to Trafalgar Square, cheered each appearance, and the BBC cameras captured everything: the Queen's face, the Duke's posture, the fluttering of robes in the wind, the precise moment when she raised her gloved hand to wave. What had once been a fleeting moment, a brief appearance to acknowledge a crowd, had become a media event choreographed for maximum visual impact. The balcony was no longer experienced primarily by those in the mall, but by millions watching on television screens. The architectural frame, the Corinthian columns, the stone balustrade, the royal coat of arms above, was now reproduced in living rooms across the country and throughout the empire. The balcony had become an image before it was a place, a two-dimensional composition that circulated endlessly, its spatial reality almost secondary to its mediated representation. This shift had profound consequences for how the balcony functioned. Television required longer appearances, multiple angles, and a performance calibrated not for the crowd 50 meters away, but for the camera lens. The Queen had to hold poses, repeat waves, and remain visible for durations that would have seemed excessive in earlier eras. The spontaneity of a brief acknowledgement gave way to the choreography of a broadcast spectacle. The stone ledge, in this new context, was less a threshold between private and public than a film set, a location that existed to be recorded, replayed, and archived. The architectural historian Adrian Forty, analyzing mid-20th century ceremonial spaces, argues that television transformed the balcony from active stage to passive backdrop. The balcony no longer did anything, it simply was, a recognizable setting that signaled monarchy, the way the Oval Office signaled presidency, or the floor of the stock exchange signaled capitalism. The stone balustrade, the columns, the coat of arms. These became visual shorthand, icons instantly decoded by viewers who might never visit London but could recognize the balcony from a single frame of footage. Elizabeth II's early reign saw the balcony used frequently for state visits, military commemorations, and trooping the color, the annual ceremony marking the sovereign's official birthday. Each June, the balcony appearance became the climax of the ceremony, with the Queen and her family gathering to watch the fly past. Photographers positioned in the mall captured these moments annually, and over time, the images created a visual timeline, children growing, fashions changing, the royal family itself evolving while the balcony remained constant. Yet this very constant created pressure. Because the balcony was architecturally unchanged, every shift in who stood upon it registered as significant. When Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister, divorced the Earl of Snowdon in 1978, her appearances on the balcony became less frequent, and the press noted her absence. When Prince Charles came of age, his position on the balcony, always beside the Queen, always visible, communicated his status as heir. The stone rail could not expand or contract, so the family arranged itself within its fixed space, and those arrangements were read as political signals, declarations of favor or disfavor, inclusion or exclusion. The center room behind the balcony was redecorated in the 1950s and 1960s to reflect Elizabeth II's taste, with brighter fabrics, modern lighting, and less Victorian clutter. Photographs taken during private tours show a room that is elegant but not overwhelming. Comfortable chairs, Chinese porcelain displayed in cabinets, portraits on silk-covered walls. The room functions as a gathering space before and after balcony appearances, a place where the family waits for the flypast or reviews the day's schedule. It is, in this sense, a green room, the theatrical space where performers prepare before stepping onto the stage. By the 1960s and 1970s, the balcony had become so central to royal identity that it appeared in virtually every documentary about the monarchy, every commemorative book, every tourist guide to London. The image was ubiquitous: the pale stone, the royal figures waving, the crowd below. Yet this ubiquity brought a kind of fatigue. The balcony had been seen so often, reproduced so many times, that it risked becoming banal, a cliché of monarchy rather than a meaningful symbol. The architectural frame remained powerful, but its power now depended on who stood within it and what narrative their presence conveyed. The Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, marking 25 years of reign, brought renewed attention to the balcony. Crowds filled the mall for the Jubilee weekend, and the balcony appearances, carefully timed, elaborately filmed, drew television audiences in the tens of millions. The image was again familiar: the Queen in bright pink, the Duke of Edinburgh beside her, children and grandchildren crowding the narrow ledge. The balustrade, cleaned specially for the Jubilee, gleamed white in the June sunshine. The royal coat of arms, its gilt freshly touched up, caught the light. The architecture performed exactly as it had been designed to perform, framing the family in a composition that projected continuity, stability, and permanence. Yet, even in 1977, cracks were beginning to show, not in the stone, but in the narrative the balcony was asked to project. The Queen's children were entering adulthood, and their marriages, relationships, and public roles would soon complicate the image of familial unity the balcony was meant to convey. The architectural frame could hold only so many people, and it could not edit out tension, unhappiness, or the fractures that were already forming behind the palace's walls. In architectural terms, the balcony by the late 1970s was entering middle age. Regular maintenance continued, stonework inspected, balusters repaired, paint refreshed. But the fundamental structure was 70 years old, built in an era when ceremonial needs were simpler and media scrutiny less intense. The narrow depth of the projection, designed for brief appearances by small groups, was being asked to contain entire extended family gatherings for prolonged periods. The physical limitations of the space were becoming evident in photographs where figures crowded against one another, children fidgeted, and the composition looked less like a formal portrait and more like an overcrowded snapshot. The balcony's television ubiquity also meant that every imperfection was magnified. A child's restlessness, a family member's absence, a moment of awkward body language, all were captured, broadcast, analyzed. The stone ledge, which in Victoria's era had offered controlled visibility, now offered total exposure. There was no privacy on the balcony, no moment unrecorded. The architecture, in its permanence, had become a trap. The family had to appear, had to wave, had to smile, regardless of whatever tensions or tragedies were unfolding inside the palace. By the time Princess Diana entered the royal family in 1981, the balcony had been a stage for over a century. It had framed Victoria's jubilees, George V's wartime appearances, and Elizabeth II's coronation. It has hosted weddings and memorials, celebrations, and silences. The stone balustrade, cleaned countless times, repaired in places, weathered in others, remained standing. Yet the question that haunted the late 20th century was whether the family framed by that stone could endure the pressures that came with such relentless visibility. The architecture promised continuity. Whether the people it displayed could live up to that promise was no longer certain. On July 29, 1981, Prince Charles, heir to the throne, married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral in a ceremony watched by a global television audience estimated at 750 million people. The day was choreographed with precision, processional routes, camera positions, and timing calibrated to maximize spectacle while maintaining the dignity required of a state occasion. Yet the moment that would be replayed endlessly in the decades that followed occurred not at the cathedral, but at Buckingham Palace, on the balcony, at approximately 1:10 in the afternoon. After the carriage procession down the Mall, the newly married couple appeared on the balcony with their families. The crowd below, estimated at 600,000 people, chanted, "Kiss, kiss, kiss," a spontaneous demand that broke with the restraint of earlier royal weddings. Charles and Diana, standing at the center of the stone balustrade, hesitated, then leaned toward each other in a brief, slightly awkward kiss. The gesture lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but cameras captured it from multiple angles, and the image was transmitted globally within minutes. The balcony kiss became the defining visual of the day, surpassing even the cathedral ceremony in cultural impact. The kiss was not unprecedented. Royal couples had shown affection on the balcony before. But its elevation to ritual expectation marked a shift in the balcony's symbolic function. The stone ledge was no longer merely a site of acknowledgement or celebration. It was now a stage for performed intimacy, a place where private affection had to be made public to satisfy the crowd's demand for emotional authenticity. The balcony, designed for dignified distance, was being asked to project closeness, vulnerability, romance. In the years that followed, the Charles and Diana marriage would become a case study in the dangers of excessive visibility. The couple appeared on the balcony regularly, for trooping the color, state occasions, and royal birthdays, and each appearance was scrutinized for signs of affection or tension. Body language was analyzed, distances between figures measured, smiles judged as genuine or forced. The balcony, which had once protected the monarchy by limiting visibility to controlled moments, now exposed every flaw. The narrow stone ledge could not hide what was visible to telephoto lenses and broadcast cameras. A marriage under strain, a relationship fracturing under the weight of public expectation. Photographs from the mid-1980s show this tension. In images from Trooping the Color in 1985, Charles and Diana stand on the balcony with their young sons, William and Harry. Diana, dressed in a striking red outfit, draws the eye. Charles, in military uniform, appears secondary. Their body language suggests distance. They do not touch, do not lean toward each other, occupy separate zones of the narrow ledge. The balcony, in these images, functions less as a frame of unity and more as a stage of performance, with each figure playing their assigned role: heir, princess, future king, spare. The cultural historian Dr. Anna Whitelock, in her study of modern monarchy, notes that the Diana years transformed public expectations of the balcony. Audiences no longer accepted the stone ledge as a site of formal presentation. They wanted emotional narrative, ongoing story, evidence of the private lives they consumed through tabloid coverage. The balcony was expected to confirm or deny rumors, to provide visual proof of relationships' health or decline. The architecture, neutral and unchanging, could not manage this demand. It could only hold the figures and let the cameras interpret. By the late 1980s, as the Charles and Diana marriage deteriorated publicly, balcony appearances became increasingly uncomfortable for all involved. Footage from these years shows the couple maintaining physical distance, their waves mechanical, their smiles practiced. The balcony, which had once been used sparingly and strategically, was now required for nearly every public event, and each appearance added to the archive of images documenting the marriage's failure. The stone rail had become a witness to dissolution, and the architectural frame that promised continuity instead recorded fragmentation. The broader royal family's troubles during this period, Princess Anne's divorce in 1992, Prince Andrew's separation the same year, the Windsor Castle fire in November 1992, culminated in Queen Elizabeth II's famous Annus Horribilis speech. Yet the balcony, throughout these crises, remained a site of required performance. Trooping the Color continued annually, and each June, the family assembled on the narrow ledge, waving to crowds while tabloids catalogued their private failures. The architectural device that had once mediated between private life and public duty now collapsed that distinction. There was no private life. Everything was public, everything visible, everything archived. Diana's death, in August 1997, following her divorce from Charles, brought the balcony's symbolic function into sharp relief. In the days after the car crash in Paris, as public grief and anger toward the royal family intensified, the family remained at Balmoral in Scotland. The balcony at Buckingham Palace stood empty. No royal figures visible, no acknowledgement of the flowers and tributes piling up at the palace gates. The absence was read as indifference, and the empty balcony became a symbol of institutional coldness. The stone ledge, so often used to project presence, now communicated through its vacancy. When the Queen finally returned to London on the eve of Diana's funeral, she made a televised address and then, briefly, appeared outside the palace gates, not on the balcony, but at ground level, walking among the flowers. The gesture was unprecedented, a break with the architectural script the balcony had established. By appearing at street level rather than elevated on the stone ledge, Elizabeth II acknowledged that the balcony's traditional function, projecting authority through architectural distance, was insufficient for the moment. The monarchy needed to be accessible, vulnerable, present in a way the balcony's neoclassical formality could not accommodate. Yet the balcony did not disappear. Trooping the Color resumed in 1998, and the family returned to the stone ledge, though noticeably smaller. Diana's absence was visible in the composition, a gap in the choreography where she had stood for 16 years. The balcony, in this context, became a site of haunting, a space where absence was as significant as presence. The stone rail held fewer people, and the images from this period show a family redefining itself, determining who belonged on the ledge and who did not. Architectural maintenance during the 1990s focused on preservation rather than alteration. The balcony structure was assessed in 1995 as part of a broader review of the east wing's condition, and engineers confirmed that the cantilevered supports remained sound. Minor repairs were made to weathered balusters, and the Portland stone was cleaned using techniques developed to minimize damage to historic masonry. The center room behind the balcony was updated with modern climate control and lighting systems, though its basic layout and decoration remained unchanged. The architecture was being preserved as heritage, even as it continued to function as active ceremonial space. By the end of the 1990s, the balcony had witnessed and framed some of the monarchy's most significant crises. The Charles and Diana marriage, played out partially on that stone ledge, had exposed the limits of architectural symbolism. The balcony could project an image, but it could not make the image true. It could frame a family, but it could not hold that family together. The stone promised permanence, but the people it displayed were subject to all the failures and fractures of mortal life. The balcony kiss of 1981, which had seemed at the time a moment of romantic triumph, now appeared in retrospect as the beginning of a narrative that would end in tragedy. The architectural frame had not changed, the same columns, the same balustrade, the same coat of arms above, yet what the frame contained had transformed utterly. The balcony, by century's end, was no longer a symbol of continuity, but a reminder of vulnerability. It showed that even the most carefully staged performances could collapse, that visibility offered no protection, that standing on a stone ledge above a crowd was no guarantee against the weight of history, expectation, and human complexity. Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee in 2002, marking 50 years of reign, arrived in the shadow of recent loss and ongoing controversy. Princess Margaret had died in February, and the Queen Mother followed in March, leaving the monarch visibly diminished by grief during the early Jubilee celebrations. Yet the formal Jubilee weekend in early June proceeded according to long-established ritual, with the balcony appearance after Trooping the Color serving as the visual climax. The family assembled on the familiar stone ledge, Elizabeth II in pale yellow, Prince Philip beside her, the Prince of Wales and his sons forming the next generation. The photograph from that day shows a smaller group than in previous decades, a conscious winnowing of who would be included in the public presentation of the royal family. The decision to limit balcony appearances to working royals and their children was not formally announced in 2002, but the pattern was emerging. Photographs show approximately 15 figures on the balcony that day, down from the larger gatherings of the 1980s when extended family members regularly appeared. This contraction reflected both practical realities, fewer working royals available, and strategic calculation. The balcony, with its limited space, could dramatize the monarchy's focus on direct succession rather than sprawling dynasty. Who stood on the stone ledge communicated institutional priority with brutal clarity. The Diamond Jubilee of 2012, marking 60 years of reign, refined this approach further. The balcony appearance on June 5, 2012, included only 6 people: the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, Camilla, Duchess of Cornwall, Prince William, and Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge. The image was striking in its spareness, vast stretches of empty stone rail on either side of the tightly grouped family. The balustrade, designed in the 1840s for Victorian-era appearances, suddenly looked oversized relative to the few figures it now held. Yet this visual economy conveyed a message. This is the monarchy's future, compressed to essential figures, streamlined for modern expectations. Aerial photographs from the Diamond Jubilee show the balcony in context, the crowd stretching down the Mall in a solid mass of humanity. An estimated 1 million people filling the ceremonial route from Admiralty Arch to the palace gates. The balcony, by comparison, looks tiny, a narrow ledge barely visible in wide shots of the palace facade. Yet it remained the focal point, the single location toward which every camera aimed and every eye turned when the glass doors behind the balustrade opened. The architectural modesty of the space, its refusal to be grand, paradoxically heightened its symbolic power. It did not need to be large. Everyone knew what it meant. The RAF flypast during the Diamond Jubilee included vintage aircraft from the Battle of Britain and modern Typhoon fighters, a historical span that paralleled the Queen's own reign from wartime through the digital age. As the aircraft roared overhead, the 6 figures on the balcony looked upward, their faces illuminated by afternoon sun. Television cameras caught every detail: the Queen's expression, the Prince's military uniforms, the Duchess's carefully chosen outfits, designed to photograph well from street level. The balcony had become a machine for generating images, and everyone involved understood their role in that machine's operation. Yet beneath the choreographed success, the Jubilee balcony appearances also revealed the physical realities of aging. The Queen, then 86, moved more slowly than in earlier decades, her steps onto the balcony carefully supported by aides. Prince Philip, 91, had been hospitalized with a bladder infection just days before and appeared visibly fatigued. The stone ledge, which had once seemed timeless, was now framing the inevitable passage of time, the aging of the figures it held, the approaching transition that everyone knew was coming, but no one could comfortably acknowledge. The center room behind the balcony underwent significant refurbishment between the Golden and Diamond Jubilees as part of broader palace maintenance. Conservation reports from this period, held in the Royal Collection archives, describe the careful restoration of decorative elements: Chinese lacquer panels cleaned, gilt details retouched, historic textiles preserved. The room's function remained unchanged, a gathering space before balcony appearances, a threshold between private preparation and public performance. But the heightened preservation efforts reflected the room's growing status as heritage space, a location that was both actively used and historically significant. By the mid-2010s, discussions of a slimmed-down monarchy had become explicit in royal communications. The balcony became the most visible manifestation of this strategy. Trooping the color appearances now routinely included only senior working royals, excluding peripheral family members whose presence had once been standard. The architectural limitation, the balcony's narrow depth, provided natural justification for these exclusions. The stone could hold only so many people comfortably. Limiting numbers was presented as logistical necessity rather than political choice. This strategy faced its most visible test during the Platinum Jubilee in June 2022, marking 70 years of Elizabeth II's reign. Months before the celebration, Buckingham Palace announced that only working royals would appear on the balcony for Trooping the Colour, explicitly excluding Prince Andrew, who had been stripped of royal duties amid scandal, and Prince Harry and Meghan, who had stepped back from working royal status in 2020. The announcement generated significant press coverage, with commentators noting that the balcony had become a tool for defining who was in and who was out of the institution's public presentation. The Platinum Jubilee balcony appearance on June 2, 2022 was sparse even by recent standards. 18 people appeared, but the composition emphasized the three generations of direct succession. Elizabeth II at center, Charles and Camilla beside her, William and Catherine with their children forming the third generation. The Queen, now 96 and using a walking stick, appeared only briefly, less than 10 minutes on the balcony, the shortest appearance of any jubilee in her reign. Photographs from that day show her leaning slightly on the stone balustrade, using its rail for physical support as well as symbolic frame. This would be Elizabeth II's final balcony appearance. She died 3 months later, on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle, having reigned longer than any British monarch before her. Her 70-year association with the balcony, from her first appearance after George VI's coronation in 1937 through her final Jubilee wave in 2022, had spanned an era of unprecedented media transformation. She had appeared on the stone ledge as a child during her grandfather's reign, as a young queen during her coronation, and as the longest reigning monarch in British history during her final year. The balcony had been one of the few constants in her life. The same stone, the same columns, the same view, down the Mall toward Admiralty Arch. Architectural assessments conducted in 2020 and 2021 as part of the Resurfacing Program, a decade-long infrastructure update for Buckingham Palace, confirmed that the balcony's structure remained sound despite over 170 years of use. Engineers examined the cantilevered beams, the stone balustrade, and the connection points to the east wing's facade, finding them all within acceptable tolerances. The Portland stone showed weathering consistent with age and exposure, but no structural concerns. Minor repairs were made to individual balusters that had developed hairline cracks, and the entire balustrade was cleaned using low-pressure water and soft brushes to avoid damaging the historic fabric. The Jubilee celebrations of the early 21st century had demonstrated both the balcony's enduring symbolic power and its limitations. It remained the single most recognizable threshold in British public life, a location that could draw millions to the Mall with the promise of a few minutes' visibility of royal figures. Yet it was also a shrinking stage, holding fewer people each decade, projecting an institution that was deliberately contracting even as it sought to remain relevant. The stone ledge promised continuity, but the family it framed was changing, aging, diminishing, refining itself for a century very different from the one in which the balcony was built. On June 5, 2022, during the final afternoon of the Platinum Jubilee celebrations, Queen Elizabeth II stepped onto the Buckingham Palace balcony for what would become her last public appearance there. She wore a bright green outfit and hat, colors chosen to be visible from the Mall where enormous screens had been erected for the crowds who could not get close enough to see the balcony directly. The appearance lasted less than 10 minutes. She stood at the center of the stone balustrade, flanked by Charles and Camilla, with William and Catherine and their children nearby. Her hand rose in the familiar wave, the gesture refined over 70 years of public performance. The crowd roared, the RAF flypast thundered overhead, a sequence of historic and modern aircraft culminating in the red arrows trailing red, white, and blue smoke. The Queen looked upward, her face caught in afternoon sunlight, and then, after a final wave, turned and withdrew through the center room's glass doors. The image circulated globally within minutes. News organizations replayed the footage throughout the evening, and social media platforms filled with stills and clips. Yet, even as the footage transmitted worldwide, those watching understood they were witnessing an ending. The Queen was 96, visibly frail, and had already scaled back public duties significantly. Her appearance on the balcony was itself remarkable. Many had expected she would not attend the Jubilee celebrations at all, given her recent mobility challenges. The balcony, which had always functioned as a stage for continuity, now framed transition. The stone ledge promised permanence, but everyone looking at it knew that the figure at its center could not remain there much longer. 3 months and 3 days later, Elizabeth II had died at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The balcony was not involved in the immediate aftermath. There was no appearance, no public moment on that stone ledge. The palace gates became the site of public mourning, covered in flowers and tributes, while the balcony stood empty above. Yet in the media coverage of her death and the subsequent 10 days of national mourning, images of the balcony appeared constantly. Archival footage of her coronation appearance, photographs from jubilees, the final Platinum Jubilee wave. The balcony, in absence, had become a monument to her reign, a recurring visual that catalogued 70 years of history compressed into a few square meters of stone. King Charles III's accession brought immediate questions about the balcony's future use. His long-stated preference for a slimmed-down monarchy, a smaller, more cost-effective institution focused on direct succession, would inevitably shape who appeared on the stone ledge and how often. His coronation, scheduled for May 6, 2023, offered the first opportunity to establish new patterns. The coronation itself was scaled back compared to 1953, shorter ceremony, smaller procession, fewer participants, and the balcony appearance followed suit. Charles and Camilla appeared with the working royals only. William and Catherine with their children, Princess Anne, Prince Edward and Sophie, and a few others. The balcony held perhaps 15 people, compared to the 80-plus who had appeared after Elizabeth II's coronation 70 years earlier. Photographs from Charles III's coronation balcony appearance show a family consciously positioning itself for a different century. The king, in military uniform, stood at the center with Camilla beside him. William, as heir, occupied the prominent position to the king's left. The composition was hierarchical, legible, designed to communicate clarity of succession. The balcony, in this usage, became an organizational chart rendered in stone and bodies, a visual diagram of institutional structure. The architectural space remained physically unchanged. The same Portland stone balustrade, cleaned in preparation for the coronation, gleamed white in May sunshine. The same Corinthian columns framed the projection. The same royal coat of arms hung above. Yet the balcony's meaning had shifted. Under Elizabeth II, it had been a stage of continuity, a location that promised the monarchy would endure because it had always endured. Under Charles III, it became a stage of transition, a location that acknowledged change even as it maintained ceremonial forms. The stone was permanent. The institution it framed was adapting. By 2024, discussions began about opening parts of the East Wing, including the center room behind the balcony, to public tours. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages palace tours, announced that guided visits would for the first time include the principal floor of the East Wing, offering access to rooms that had previously been seen only by royals, staff, and a select few guests. The tours, scheduled to begin in summer 2024, would bring visitors into the center room itself, allowing them to stand in the space where royals gathered before stepping onto the balcony to look through the glass doors at the stone ledge, to see the view that sovereigns saw before turning to face the crowd. The decision to open these spaces was presented as pragmatic. The reservicing program had made extensive infrastructure improvements, and opening the rooms to visitors would generate revenue to support ongoing conservation. Yet the symbolic implications were profound. The balcony's threshold, which had always been exclusive, was being partially democratized. Visitors could approach the edge, though not cross it. The glass doors remained locked, the balcony itself inaccessible. The center room became a kind of viewing platform in reverse. Instead of looking down at the crowd, tourists would look out at the balcony, imagining themselves in the position of those who had stood there. Tour materials prepared by the Royal Collection Trust described the center room's history and decoration. The Chinese lacquer panels moved from Brighton's Royal Pavilion, the Kylin clock gifted to George IV. the silk wall coverings and crystal chandeliers. The room's function as gathering space before balcony appearances was noted but not dramatized. The emphasis remained on artistic merit, architectural detail, and historical significance. Yet, simply by being accessible, the room lost some of its mystery. The threshold between public and private, which the balcony had always mediated, was shifting. The backstage was becoming part of the show. Conservation reports from the resurfacing program, published in late 2023, provided detailed accounts of work done on the East Wing between 2020 and 2024. The balcony itself required minimal intervention. The structure was sound, the stone weathered but intact. The main focus was the infrastructure behind it, updating electrical systems, improving climate control in the center room, reinforcing floor supports in adjacent spaces. The work was careful, respectful of historic fabric, designed to extend the building's life for another century while accommodating contemporary needs. The reports included archival photographs showing the balcony at various stages, construction views from the 1840s, Victorian-era images of early appearances, wartime damage and repair, late 20th century maintenance. Seen in sequence, the images revealed both permanence and change. The balustrade looked identical across decades, yet the context shifted constantly. Different crowds, different fashions, different political realities framed by the same stone ledge. The architecture persisted, everything else transformed. By early 2025, the balcony under Charles III had established a new rhythm. Trooping the color remained an annual occasion for balcony appearances, now limited to approximately a dozen working royals. State visits still concluded with brief appearances, though less frequently than in earlier decades. The king's approach favored restraint, fewer balcony moments, each more carefully calibrated, designed to maintain the ledge's symbolic power by not overusing it. The balcony was becoming rarer again, closer to its late Victorian role as an occasional ceremonial device rather than a constant media location. Yet the physical reality of the balcony remained accessible through architecture. The stone could be visited now if not stepped upon. The center room could be entered, its threshold approached. The glass doors marked the final boundary, transparent, visible through, but locked. Tourists stood inside looking out at the empty balcony, imagining the crowds, the flypasts, the cameras. The architecture invited projection. Place yourself here, imagine the moment, feel the weight of visibility. The balcony, even empty, even separated by glass, retained its power to focus attention and generate narrative. The architectural historian Gavin Stamp, reflecting on ceremonial spaces in the late 20th century, wrote, "A threshold becomes sacred not through design, but through use. The balcony at Buckingham Palace is architecturally unremarkable, a projecting ledge, some balusters, classical details. Yet repetition has made it iconic. We recognize it instantly, not for what it is, but for what it has held." By 2025, the balcony had held over 170 years of history. It had framed Victoria's grief and jubilation, George V's wartime resolve, Elizabeth II's 7-decade reign. It had witnessed weddings and funerals, celebrations and silences. And it would continue, the stone enduring, waiting for the next moment when doors would open and figures would emerge, turning private life into public architecture once again. The transformation of the balcony from active ceremonial space to heritage site with controlled public access represents a fundamental shift in its architectural meaning. When the Royal Collection Trust opened the East Wing tours in July 2024, visitors entered through the palace's grand entrance and moved through a sequence of staterooms before ascending to the principal floor. The route was carefully designed to build anticipation, formal reception rooms, corridors lined with portraits, and then the principal corridor itself, a long, silk-hung passage that connects the palace's ceremonial spaces. At the corridor's eastern end, visitors entered the center room, the threshold to the balcony. Tour groups, limited to 15 people, and scheduled at 20-minute intervals throughout the day, were guided into the center room and given approximately 5 minutes to observe the space. The room, decorated in Chinese-influenced style with lacquer panels, porcelain, and gilt furnishings, functioned as both historical interior and viewing platform. The glass doors to the balcony were closed but not curtained, offering a clear view of the stone balustrade and the space beyond. Tourists pressed against the glass, taking photographs of the balcony from this interior perspective, documenting the threshold they could not cross. The view from inside the center room, looking out toward the balcony, revealed the space's modest scale. The projection measured approximately 2.7 meters deep and 8 meters wide, barely larger than a single-car garage. The stone balustrade rose about 1 meter high, its balusters spaced at regular intervals in classical proportion. Beyond the rail, the mall stretched toward Admiralty Arch, a vista of ceremonial avenue framed by trees and buildings. From this perspective, the crowd's position became clear, hundreds of meters away, looking upward at an angle, separated by distance, iron railings, and the symbolic weight of architecture. Docents accompanying the tours provided historical context drawn from Royal Collection archives. They described the balcony's construction in the 1840s, its first use during the Great Exhibition celebrations, its role in wartime and Jubilee appearances. They pointed out specific features: the Portland stone's texture, the relationship between the balustrade and the columns flanking it, and the royal coat of arms above. They explained the logistics of ceremonial use, how the royal family gathered in the center room before appearances, how timing was coordinated with flypasts and crowd size, and how the narrow space constrained the choreography of large family groups. What the tours did not provide, could not provide, was the experience of actually standing on the balcony, of feeling stone beneath feet and crowd noise rising from below, of crossing the threshold from private room to public stage. The balcony remained off-limits, accessible only to royals and palace staff. The glass doors enforced this boundary, transparent but impassable, allowing vision but preventing access. Tourists could imagine the experience, could project themselves into the space, but could not inhabit it. The architecture remained exclusive even as it became visible. The decision to open the center room while keeping the balcony itself inaccessible reflects a careful negotiation between heritage access and institutional authority. By allowing tourists to approach the threshold, the palace acknowledged the public's interest in the space and its history. By maintaining the final boundary, the institution preserved the balcony's symbolic potency. If anyone could step onto the ledge, it would cease to be a stage of sovereignty. The glass doors, though, physically thin, marked a profound division: those who look and those who are looked at. Conservation priorities for the balcony and center room, outlined in Royal Collection Trust planning documents, emphasize preservation over alteration. The increased foot traffic from public tours required upgrades to climate control and lighting in the center room to protect historic furnishings and textiles. The balcony itself, exposed to weather but not to tourist contact, required only ongoing maintenance: annual cleaning, inspection of stone and metalwork, repairs to any weathering or damage. The architectural fabric, approaching 180 years old, was stable enough to continue its dual function: active ceremonial space and historical monument. Visitor feedback collected during the first months of the East Wing tours revealed the balcony's enduring fascination. Surveys showed that the center room and its view of the balcony ranked among the most memorable elements of the tour, surpassing rooms with more elaborate decoration or valuable art. Visitors reported feeling a sense of proximity to history, of standing in a space where the Queen stood, of seeing the balcony from the royal family's perspective rather than the crowd's usual view from below. The architecture, in its ordinariness, seemed to make history accessible, not grand or overwhelming, but intimate and comprehensible. Yet this accessibility also generated a kind of disappointment. Several visitors noted in survey responses that the balcony looked smaller than expected, less impressive than its photographic representations suggested. Seeing the stone ledge from the center room, without crowds and flypasts and the media apparatus that usually surrounded balcony appearances, revealed its physical modesty. The gap between symbolic power and architectural reality was visible. The balcony mattered enormously, but it was just a projection of stone, a ledge barely wider than a hallway. The Royal Collection Trust responded to this feedback by enhancing interpretive materials. New display panels in the center room showed archival photographs of significant balcony moments, Victoria's early appearances, VE Day celebrations, Elizabeth II's coronation. Short video clips, played on discrete monitors, demonstrated the balcony's use during Trooping the Colour and royal weddings. The interpretive approach attempted to restore, through media, the balcony's symbolic weight that its physical presence alone could not convey. The stone needed a story. Architecture alone was insufficient. By late 2024, the East Wing tours had attracted tens of thousands of visitors, generating significant revenue for the Royal Collection Trust's conservation programs. The access was limited. Tours operated only during summer months when the palace's staterooms were open to the public, and capacity was restricted by the need to preserve the historic interiors. Yet, even limited access represented a dramatic shift in the palace's relationship with public space. The center room, which for 170 years had been a private royal gathering space, was now a semi-public viewing platform. The boundary between palace and public had moved, though the balcony itself remained behind that boundary, still exclusive, still reserved. Architectural critics debated the implications of this shift. Some argued that opening the center room enhanced public understanding of royal ceremonial, demystifying the architecture without diminishing its historical significance. Others worried that treating the space as a heritage site while it remained actively used created confusion. Was it a museum or a working palace? The balcony's dual status, functional ceremonial space and historical monument, made it difficult to categorize. It belonged simultaneously to the present and the past, to active use and preserved memory. The Royal Collection Trust's conservation philosophy, articulated in planning documents and public statements, emphasized living heritage, the idea that historic buildings should continue their original functions rather than being frozen as museums. The balcony embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was still used for Trooping the Colour, coronations, and significant state occasions, maintaining its designed purpose. Yet it was also being documented, interpreted, and made partially accessible as a historical site. The architecture served both present needs and future memory. Inside the center room, conservation work was ongoing even as tours proceeded. Textile specialists monitored the silk wall coverings for signs of deterioration from increased humidity caused by visitor presence. Climate control systems were adjusted to maintain stable temperature and relative humidity. Lighting levels were measured to ensure UV exposure remained within conservation tolerances. The room was being preserved even as it was used, maintained even as it was displayed, conserved even as it generated revenue to fund further conservation. The balcony balustrade, visible through the center room's glass doors, showed the accumulated effects of nearly 180 years of exposure. Close observation revealed subtle weathering, edges softened by wind-driven rain, faint discoloration from atmospheric pollution, hairline cracks in some balusters where water had penetrated and frozen. Yet the structure remained sound. Stone chosen in the 1840s for its durability had proven worthy of that choice. Portland limestone, quarried from Dorset cliffs and transported to London by barge and cart, had outlasted the builders who shaped it, the monarchs who commissioned it, and most of the buildings constructed around it. The glass doors themselves, installed and replaced multiple times over the balcony's history, marked the current technical boundary between access and exclusion. Their transparency was political as much as physical. They allowed vision without contact, observation without participation. Standing in the center room, looking through glass at the balcony and beyond it to the mall, tourists occupied a liminal position. Inside the palace but not inside the family, close to power but separated from it, able to imagine the experience of standing on the balcony but unable to actually have that experience. This liminality defined the modern relationship between monarchy and public. The architecture permitted proximity but maintained distance, offered visibility but preserved exclusivity. The balcony could be seen, photographed, studied, but not inhabited by anyone outside the institution it represented. The stone ledge remained a stage for sovereignty, and sovereignty, by definition, could not be shared. The tours brought visitors to the threshold, then held them there, allowing them to look but not to cross, to observe but not to become. Under King Charles III, the balcony entered a new phase of calculated restraint. His vision for a working monarchy, limited to direct succession and essential participants, manifested most visibly in trooping the color appearances, where the balcony group contracted to approximately a dozen figures, a dramatic reduction from the extended family gatherings of previous decades. Photographs from the June 2023 and June 2024 trooping ceremonies show this compression clearly. The King and Queen Camilla at center, the Prince and Princess of Wales with their children to one side, Princess Anne and Prince Edward with spouses completing the group. The stone balustrade, which had once been crowded to capacity, now held a carefully curated selection, with significant stretches of empty rail visible in images. This visual spareness served multiple purposes. Practically, it simplified the logistics of balcony appearances and reduced the time required for the royal family to assemble. Symbolically, it communicated institutional focus. These were the working royals, the figures carrying out duties, the core of the modern monarchy. Politically, it managed expectations about who held status within the institution and who did not. The balcony had become an exclusion device as much as a presentation platform. Being absent from the balcony now carried meaning equal to being present upon it. The 80th anniversary of VE Day, in May 2025, demonstrated this evolved usage. Charles III, wearing a naval uniform virtually identical to that worn by his grandfather George VI during the original VE Day celebrations in 1945, appeared on the balcony with a small group of family members and military representatives. Archival photographs of George VI in 1945 were displayed on screens in the mall, creating a direct visual link between 1945 and 2025, between grandfather and grandson, between wartime generation and contemporary monarchy. The balcony served as the constant in this comparison, the architectural element that made the generational echo legible. Same stone, same columns, same projection, different faces, different century. The VE Day 80 ceremony also highlighted ongoing debates about the balcony's appropriate use. Veterans organizations had requested that survivors of the Second World War be permitted onto the balcony to mark the anniversary, a proposal that generated significant media discussion. The palace declined, citing space limitations and security concerns, but offered instead a separate ceremony where veterans were honored at ground level while the royal family observed from the balcony. The decision was criticized by some as maintaining unnecessary hierarchy. Why should veterans who fought the war be excluded from the space while royals who inherited their positions were granted access? The balcony's exclusivity, taken for granted in earlier eras, was now questioned. These questions reflected broader uncertainties about monarchy's role in contemporary democracy. The balcony, as the most visible symbol of royal presence, became a focal point for these debates. Should it remain exclusive to the royal family, preserving its traditional function, or should it be opened, literally and symbolically, to recognize that sovereignty in a modern constitutional monarchy derives from the people, not from dynastic inheritance? The architecture could not resolve these questions, but it framed them. Every balcony appearance generated renewed discussion about who belonged on that ledge and why. Practical challenges also shaped the balcony's use under Charles III. Both he and Queen Camilla were in their 70s, and Princess Anne and Prince Edward were in their 60s. The working royals who appeared regularly on the balcony represented an aging cohort with the younger generation, William and Catherine still in their 40s, not yet fully assuming senior roles. The balcony's future use depended on this generational transition, and photographs from 2024 and 2025. Trooping ceremonies showed William and his children occupying increasingly prominent positions, a visual transition occurring in real time. The reservicing program's final phase, completed in early 2025, included comprehensive documentation of the East Wing's architectural and historical significance. Laser scanning captured the balcony and surrounding structures in minute detail, creating a digital archive that recorded every surface, every dimension, every imperfection. This documentation served multiple purposes: conservation planning, architectural analysis, and creation of a permanent record in case of damage or loss. The balcony, approaching 2 centuries old, was being preserved digitally even as it continued to function physically. The digital archive revealed aspects of the balcony's construction not visible to casual observation. The cantilevered iron beams supporting the stone projection showed signs of 19th century manufacturing: forge marks, slight irregularities in cross-section, evidence of hand finishing. The Portland stone balustrade, examined at microscopic resolution, showed not only weathering but repair. Patches where damaged balusters had been replaced, repointing where mortar had been renewed, subtle differences in stone color indicating work done in different decades. The balcony was not a single artifact, but a palimpsest. Layers of maintenance and repair accumulated over 180 years. Conservation scientists analyzing the digital scans projected that with proper maintenance, the balcony could remain structurally sound for at least another century. The iron supports, though showing surface corrosion, retained full load-bearing capacity. The stone, despite weathering, remained well adhered to its backing structure. The main vulnerability was not structural failure, but gradual degradation of surface detail. The crisp edges of balusters softening, carved ornament losing definition, stone texture becoming smoother. This degradation was manageable through careful cleaning and occasional stone replacement, but it was also inevitable. The balcony would persist, but it would slowly transform, each decade leaving subtle marks. By mid-2025, the balcony's annual rhythm had stabilized under Charles III. Trooping the color in June remained the primary occasion for use, with occasional appearances for state visits and significant commemorations. The total number of balcony appearances per year dropped to 5 or 6, down from 15 or more during Elizabeth II's most active decades. This reduction was partly deliberate, restraint intended to preserve symbolic power, and partly circumstantial, reflecting fewer working royals available for public duties. The balcony was becoming rarer, its appearances more weighted with significance precisely because they occurred less frequently. The center room behind the balcony, now accessible through Royal Collection Trust tours during summer months, offered visitors a paradoxical experience. They stood in a space intimately connected to the royal ceremonial, yet they occupied it as tourists, not participants. They saw the balcony from the threshold, not from the position of those who crossed it. They observed the architecture that framed sovereignty without experiencing sovereignty itself. This gap between proximity and participation defined the modern relationship between monarchy and public. The institution permitted observation but maintained separation, offered visibility but reserved privilege. Architectural historians studying the balcony in the 2020s focused increasingly on its symbolic evolution. Early scholarship had treated it as a functional space, a projection designed for crowd acknowledgement. Later analysis recognized its role as a media stage, a location optimized for photography and broadcast. By the 2020s, scholars were examining the balcony as a boundary device, a threshold that simultaneously connected and separated, revealed and concealed, included and excluded. The stone balustrade was not merely a supportive structure, but a line of demarcation marking who could stand there and who could not, who was inside the institution and who remained outside. The balcony's future remained uncertain in ways both trivial and profound. Trivially, questions of maintenance and repair would continue, which balusters would need replacement, how weathering would be managed when the next comprehensive conservation campaign would occur. Profoundly, questions of symbolic relevance persisted. Would the balcony retain its cultural power in subsequent decades, or would changing attitudes toward monarchy and technology's transformation of public space render it archaic? The stone itself would endure, but its meaning was contingent, always subject to the shifting ground of politics, media, and public sentiment. What remained constant was the architecture itself, the Portland stone balusters in their rhythmic spacing, the cantilevered projection, 3 meters deep, holding its careful load. The glass doors marking the threshold between center room and balcony, between preparation and performance, between private life and public display. These physical facts persisted regardless of who stood upon them or what meanings were projected onto them. The balcony was stone, iron, glass, materials shaped by 19th century craft and maintained through 21st century technology. It held history, not through intention, but through simple persistence, outlasting the figures it framed, outlasting the nations they claimed to represent, outlasting every certainty except the basic architectural fact of its own existence. The balcony above the mall was never meant to carry so much history. When Edward Bloor drew the plans in the 1840s and Thomas Cubitt's workers laid the Portland stone, the projection was functional, a small ledge to allow occasional acknowledgement of crowds during ceremonial moments. The architecture was modest, almost forgettable in its neoclassical restraint, yet repetition made it sacred. Victoria appeared there, and George V and Elizabeth II. Each appearance added weight to the stone until the balustrade could barely support the accumulated meanings projected onto it. By 2025, the balcony had become less a physical space than a palimpsest of images. Millions of photographs documented its use, Victorian sepia prints showing distant figures barely visible, wartime shots of George VI and the bombed city behind him, Technicolor jubilees with the Queen in bright colors designed for television, digital images from Charles III's coronation distributed instantaneously across global networks. Each photograph added another layer to the balcony's meaning, until the stone itself almost disappeared beneath its representations. What people saw when they looked at the balcony was not architecture, but accumulated history. Every previous appearance layered onto the present moment. This compression of time and space is perhaps the balcony's most profound characteristic. Standing on that ledge, a monarch occupies the exact position Victoria occupied in 1851, George V in 1918, Elizabeth II in 1953. The stone beneath contemporary feet is the same stone, slightly worn, carefully maintained, but fundamentally unchanged. The view down the mall is altered by modern lighting and traffic controls, but the spatial relationship remains. Palace elevated, crowd below, ceremonial avenue connecting them. The architecture creates temporal continuity in a world where almost everything else transforms constantly. Yet this continuity also creates pressure. Each new figure stepping onto the balcony must perform history as well as presence. They are not only themselves, but also the accumulated weight of everyone who has stood there before. The stone rail becomes a ghosted space, haunted by previous occupants, previous waves, previous versions of the monarchy, standing at that same threshold facing similar yet transformed crowds. The architecture demands performance that acknowledges tradition while remaining current, that projects stability while adapting to change. This is an impossible demand, yet it is made with every balcony appearance. The recent opening of the center room to public tours has altered the balcony's mystique without diminishing its power. Visitors now understand that the threshold is ordinary, glass doors, a step down onto stone, nothing architecturally extraordinary. Yet, understanding the ordinariness somehow heightens the symbolic weight. The balcony's power comes not from exceptional design, but from consecrated use. It matters because it has mattered, because appearances there have been recorded and remembered, because the architecture has been made to carry meanings far beyond its physical capacity. Conservation challenges will intensify in coming decades. The Portland stone, though durable, is not immune to London's climate and atmospheric pollution. Each winter's freeze-thaw cycles cause incremental damage. Each summer's heat accelerates chemical weathering. The iron cantilevered supports, though structurally sound in 2025, will eventually require replacement or reinforcement. The balustrade itself may need substantial repair or partial reconstruction within the next 50 years. These interventions will test the institution's commitment to preservation. Will damaged original stone be retained, even as it degrades or replaced with new material that looks identical but lacks historical fabric? There is no correct answer, only choices that balance physical preservation with symbolic authenticity. The question of who will stand on the balcony in 2050, 2100 is unanswerable. Constitutional monarchy in Britain has proven remarkably resilient, adapting to democratic reforms that eliminated most royal political power while maintaining the institution's ceremonial role. Yet, this resilience is not guaranteed. Public attitudes toward hereditary privilege shift, economic pressures challenge state funding of royalty, and the media environment continues to evolve in ways that may not favor traditional ceremonial forms. The balcony could persist as a heritage site long after it ceases to function as an active ceremonial space, a preserved architectural element open fully to tourists, explained by interpretive panels, but no longer hosting a living monarchy. Alternatively, the balcony might continue its current function for centuries, periodically adapted but fundamentally unchanged, a rare architectural constant in an ever-transforming city. The stone would be repaired and replaced incrementally, the way medieval cathedrals have been maintained, every component eventually renewed, yet the whole retaining continuity through careful preservation philosophy. Future monarchs would stand there, waving to crowds whose demographic composition, technological augmentation, and social attitudes we cannot predict, but performing a ritual recognizable across centuries. What seems certain is that the balcony will persist as an image even if its physical existence ends. The photographs, videos, and digital archives have permanently preserved the balcony's appearances in forms that cannot decay the way stone does. These archived images will outlast the architecture, circulating through future media systems, studied by future historians, misunderstood by future viewers who lack context for the ceremonial forms they document. The balcony's afterlife as representation may ultimately exceed its life as functional space. The narrow stone balustrade, barely 1 meter high and 2.7 meters deep, has proven adequate to hold more history than its builders could have imagined. Victoria wanted a convenient way to acknowledge crowds. What she got was an architectural device that would define her dynasty's relationship with its subjects for 2 centuries. The balcony became a site where private life was temporarily suspended, where individuals transformed into symbols, where the ordinary human desire for acknowledgement and visibility was sublimated into state ceremonial. It is a threshold between the prosaic reality of being a person and the abstraction of representing an institution. To cross from the center room onto the balcony is to step from humanity into symbol, from self into office. The royal family cannot escape this transformation. Once on the balcony, they are no longer individuals, but embodiments of monarchy, continuity, nation. The architecture enforces this transformation through its spatial logic, elevated above the crowd, separated by distance and railings, framed by classical columns and the royal coat of arms. Every element of the composition insists on the distinction between those on the balcony and those below. Yet the very need for this architectural enforcement reveals the fiction at its core. Without the stone rail, the elevation, the framing elements, the figures on the balcony would be merely people. The architecture creates monarchy as much as monarchy uses the architecture. This reciprocal relationship between institution and building, between people and stone, defines the balcony's significance. It is not simply that the royal family appears on the balcony, but that the balcony makes them royal. The stone ledge performs a kind of alchemy, transforming individuals into sovereigns through the act of framing them within its specific architectural space. Stand in the center room, and you are a person in a palace. Step across the threshold onto the balcony, and you become a monarch facing a nation. The transformation takes only seconds, requires only a few steps, but the architectural boundary makes it absolute. Looking forward, this alchemy will face its greatest test. Can architecture continue to create and sustain symbolic authority in an age increasingly skeptical of inherited privilege? Can a stone balustrade above a London avenue maintain its power when information technology has demolished almost every other boundary between elite and mass, between powerful and ordinary? The balcony's persistence depends not on its stone, which will endure with care, but on society's willingness to continue recognizing the meanings projected onto it. If that recognition fades, if the crowd stops gathering, if the cameras stop focusing on that particular ledge, the balcony will remain architecturally intact while becoming symbolically inert. Yet as of 2025, the balcony still works. Crowds still gather when announcements indicate a royal appearance. Cameras still focus on that narrow projection. The architectural frame still converts presence into spectacle, individuals into symbols. The stone holds its history and continues to accumulate more. Each appearance adds another layer of meaning, another image to the archive, another moment in the ongoing performance of monarchy through architecture. The ledge above the mall was carved to let a family step outside. Over 180 years, those steps compressed into a ritual that defined how monarchy presented itself to modernity. The balcony promised visibility without vulnerability, presence without intimacy, continuity without change. It delivered these promises through the simple architectural fact of elevation and framing. Yet beneath the promises lay a deeper truth. The balcony worked because both sides wanted it to. The royal family wanted to be seen. The crowd wanted to see. The architecture provided the stage for this mutual desire, framing one of the oldest human transactions, the exchange of visibility for recognition, presence for acknowledgement, in the specific forms required by constitutional monarchy. But no wall, however thick, can keep history from turning private lives into public architecture. The balcony proved this repeatedly. Victoria's grief was staged there. George V's wartime determination was framed there. Elizabeth II's long reign began and ended on that ledge. Charles and Diana's marriage was celebrated there and implicitly dissolved there in later tense appearances. The stone was neutral, but history was not. Every appearance added weight until the balcony became less a structure than a story, a narrative of dynasty told through architecture, of continuity performed on a ledge barely wide enough for the family it was meant to hold. In the end, the balcony is exactly what it appears to be: a narrow projection of Portland stone, cantilevered from a palace facade, marking a threshold between interior and exterior, private and public, person and symbol. Its power comes not from exceptional design, but from determined use, from the accumulated weight of moments when individuals stepped across glass doors onto stone, transforming themselves briefly into monarchy, into continuity, into the illusion that some things endure. The stone endures. Whether what it frames can match that endurance remains the question no architecture can answer.